welcome today to meet with our panelists, the editors of Makeshift Chicago Stages. It's a wonderful book, and I am so excited to have Megan, Stuart, and Jasmine here to share their book with you. I'm also really excited to welcome them back to Chicago Public Library because they've been here before. I've had the pleasure of working with them as researchers here in our Special Collections and Preservation Division, where we have the Chicago Theater Collection. All three are wonderful researchers who have dug into our huge collection that dates from 1848 with early playbills from Rice's Theater on up to present day productions here in Chicago. It's a wonderful resource, and I'm so excited to see what our researchers can do with it. I would invite you to save questions for our panelists. For the end, I will facilitate chat and Q&A. And I'd like to share just a little bit about our panelists. So Megan Geigner has published in several periodicals, including New Theater Quarterly, Theater Journal, and Modern Drama. Her research focuses on how performance creates ethnic, civic, and racial identity in and at such events as parades, world's fairs, commemorative monuments, and traditional theater. She serves in leadership for the Association of Theater and Higher Education and an artistic associate with Chicago's Timeline Theater. Geigner has served on the board of directors for Neo Futurists, and since 2009 has worked as a dramaturg at several theaters in Chicago. She's an assistant professor of instruction in the Cook Family Writing Program at Northwestern University. Stuart Hecht has published more than 30 articles in journals, including Theater Journal, the Journal of American Theater and Drama, and Chicago History. He's written chapters in 5 major books as well. His book, Transposing Broadway, Jews, Assimilation, and the American Musical, was recommended by the Journal Choice. He's a longstanding editor-in-chief of New England Theater Journal and an editorial board member for Theater Annual, Journal of American Drama and Theater, and Studies in Musical Theater. Hecht also sits on the boards of the New England Theater Conference and the Chicago Theater History Project, is an officer of the American Theater and Drama Society, and was named a fellow of the Mid-America Theater Conference. He's an associate professor of theater at Boston College. Jasmine Mahmoud has published in several journals, including Modern Drama, Performance Research, and TDR, the Drama Review, and in several edited collections. An urban ethnographer and performance historian, her research examines experimental theater practices staged in urban margins, relationships among aesthetics, race, policy, and space, and the role of artistic practices in decolonial anti-racist neighborhood processes. She has served in leadership positions with the Association for Theater in Higher Education. Mahmoud is also an assistant professor in the Department of Performing Arts and Arts Leadership at Seattle University. So please help me welcome our panelists. I am so excited to have them here today, and clearly they bring a great wealth of knowledge, not just about Chicago theater, which is our specialty, but beyond. But today we are here to talk about Makeshift Chicago Stages. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Megan to welcome you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us, that we could talk about this book with you. This was a real labor of love for the three of us, and so it's such a joy to share it with other people who are interested in the topic, or interested in us, or interested in Chicago Public Libraries. So you heard in the introduction, Stuart is in Boston, I'm in Chicago, and Jasmine is in Seattle. She has, since that bio was written, taken a job at the University of Washington in their theater department. And so we're tri-coastal, as one might say. So we have some slides partly to help you see some of the work that we did. And we're going to invite Sarah to pop in when she sees an image that she thinks is from their collection, right? The Chicago Public Library collection. And also so that we can just sort of know where we are as we're talking, since we're clearly not in the same room. So I'm just going to go ahead and share those with you. So this is what the book looks like if you hadn't had a chance to see it yet. We requested from the press that the cover of the book emulate the Chicago flag. And let me tell you a little bit about how this came to be. So Jasmine and I met professionally as graduate students at Northwestern University in PhD programs. She was in performance studies. I was in theater and drama. And Stuart and I met professionally at a conference that was hosted by Columbia College in 2011 about the history of Chicago theater. And that's also where I think I met Sarah for the first time. The three of us discovered that we were doing a lot of work on Chicago theater. It's kind of an under-researched area when we talk about sort of theater and performance scholarship, even though one can argue it's the most, I will argue it is the most important theater city in America. And so we had started doing presentations at professional organization conferences together. Oh, sorry, my computer likes that to pop up. You know, we did quite a few panels together, and then we thought, you know, this really should be a book. And so we started working together to make this into a book. This map is at the beginning of the book. We thought it would be helpful for folks who were less familiar with Chicago. And you can see we really tried to talk about theater all over the city as much as possible. This map was also made for us by the GIS department at Northwestern. So I'd like to acknowledge Kelsey Ryland for doing that for us. As we started working on the book, so we had some folks that we knew from conferences who'd been writing about Chicago, and so we let them know, hey, what if we made this a book? And then people said like, yes, I'd love to, or I don't have time for that, or you know, all the kind of requests you get when you ask people to do labor. And once we had sort of a group of people who were interested in working together, we looked at what people wanted to work on, and we saw that there are really sort of three sections of the book. And so while there are three sections of the book, Stuart, Jasmine, and I, we worked on the whole book together. We wrote the introduction collectively, but we sort of took ownership over each one of the sections just to make the labor a little more manageable. So the first section, which Stuart is going to tell us about here in just a second, is theater artistry born of the ashes. And that sort of takes us into the 19 teens and the early 20s. The next section is from mainstream to institutionalized, and that was the section that I focused on. That starts in the 1920s and goes until about the 1970s. So because I work as a historian, I always think about things chronologically. Obviously, there's many other ways we could have organized the text, but this just sort of made sense to us. And then the third sections, which Jasmine really took ownership over, was centering the Decentered, Itinerant, Civic, and Home. So I'm going to pass it off to Stuart to talk about his section of the book and the chapters that make that section up.
Thanks so much, Megan. And thank you, Sarah, and to the Chicago Library. We are always so grateful. The first thing I just want to mention, a personal note, which is that I'm from Chicago. I'm actually from Cleveland, but my mom's family is from Chicago. And I went to Northwestern also. And that I worked at the Goodman Theater under Greg Mosher, and I worked at Wisdom Bridge under Bob Falls at the same time as I worked on my dissertation, which I'm now making into a book about Hull House and its remarkable theater for many, many years. So it's fascinating to look at the scope and range of Chicago theater and also to its originality. There's something very special about the theater. In addition to what Megan said, I agree wholeheartedly. I do think that Chicago is the most remarkable and the most exciting theater city in the country. And I think also the most important for reasons I think that our book actually illuminates. But it comes from several angles, which leads me to my final pre-point, which is at that conference on Chicago theater at Columbia College in 2011, to which Megan referred, our late colleague, Arvid Sponberg, was one of the organizers. And I remember him getting up in front of everybody, and he is at part of the big assemblage of all these wonderful theater professionals and scholars, by the way. And that's the point. He held up two books. And in one hand, he held up a book that was about, I'll call it a coffee table book, in the sense of saying about the wonderful people and the stories about the people that did Chicago theater and the anecdotes. But in his other hand, he had a scholarly book. And his point was, we need both. And I think in recent years, we've seen both emerge. Most notably, perhaps on the anecdotal side would be Mark Larson's marvelous book, Ensemble, which is, read it if you haven't yet. It's a fantastic collection of oral histories, personal stories from about 50 years of people who are active and continue to be active in Chicago theater. But on the other side was, which is a little bit more challenging, is how do we get people nationally to understand and appreciate what Megan said, which is to say that Chicago theater is important, noteworthy, and unique. And I think that, oh, see, there's Megan, and bless her heart, there's her copy of Ensemble. This is like Vanna White, you know. And our own book will, I think, represent the scholarly side of the equation, if you will. But it really is true. Now, in terms of the first third of our book, as we said, it's about, I wrote that, and it's about Out of the Ashes. And, at that time, this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a little bit more. I mean, the whole point, I don't know why I started writing about that, honestly, except that it really fed into what I was writing about in terms of my own article. But really saying that there's a history in Chicago of disaster, disasters, good Lord, but out of which theaters have perhaps suffered, but also benefited. And certainly the city itself has benefited. So the first major example of this, as you can see, there's a marvelous photo we found of the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Now, it was in 1893, even though it commemorated Christopher Columbus. And if you'll do your math, you'll notice that that's a year off. Now, I don't know what that says about Chicago, except maybe they just want to do such a good job that they wanted to make sure it took an extra year for them to do it. But the point was that Chicago was founded in 1833. The first professional theater company to come in town really included a young man named Joseph Jefferson, who was part of an acting company. And that's why the Chicago Theater Awards to this day are the Jefferson Awards, But it really established that even from the very beginning, there was an interest in it. And yet, while there was an interest in it, at the same time, most of the stuff that we're talking about today is not traveling companies. It's, lots of cities will have their exhibition theaters, if you will, places where touring Broadway shows will be presented. And Chicago does too, things like the Blackstone, stuff like that, the Schubert houses, the Niederlander houses. But what we're talking about is grassroots. In other words, stuff that actually emerges out of the community. And while there are these pre-existing formal theaters, Chicago's history and its theatrical heritage really is tied much more to unorthodox spaces. Spaces that have the term I came up with was makeshift. Here's a space, it's not being used for anything, but there's a bunch of people that want to do theater. Let's figure how to do it here. Well, that means you don't have fly systems. It means you don't have all the stuff to do special effects. It means that what you're going to do are basically plays and put the focus on the plays, playwrights' voices, great acting, and innovative directors. But more than that, unlike any other city in the country, the audience as well. Chicago is very much about the dialogue between the performers and the audience. Whereas I think in the East Coast and the West Coast, it's more performed for the audience. And I also think, as Megan showed that marvelous book of Marx, the operative word ensemble. A sense of community is really a fundamental theme throughout Chicago's theater history. Now, what about this picture? This is, again, the Columbian Exposition of 1893. It was designed by, oh God, you guys help me, I just spaced on his name. Oh Lord, you're not supposed to space, Stuart.
Daniel Burnham.
No, it's not Burnham. It's the same guy that designed Central Park, and he also designed.
Oh, yeah.
See, the people in the audience.
Yeah, Olmsted. Thanks,
yes.
Sarah.
Thank you. Frederick Law Olmsted, there he is. But they brought him in from New York. He had designed Central Park. He was the hot designer because what happened was in 1871, Chicago burned down. And as you may well know, the only building that's kind of survived that, ironically now a theater, is the Water Tower, right? And, but a lot of the city burned down in a weird way. You could say it was a disaster, and it certainly was a disaster, but it also gave the city a chance to rebuild and reinvent itself and reimagine itself. The other part of the story is that, after the Civil War, a lot of big money and businesses, Pullman and armor and all that stuff was a result of really Civil War money. And they said, you know what, East Coast, you're looking down your noses at us. Hey, New York, you think you're cool? Guess what? We are too. They looked at the Midwest as being butchers and the stockyards, all that sort of stuff. We're actually cultured. So they wanted to do a big event that promoted the city, but also demonstrated that they were in fact cultured. And in fact, it is, of course, a lot of the well-to-do families in Chicago from that era actually came from the Northeast, the United States. So they established and built this very ambitious Columbia Exposition of 1893. As you can see, there's gorgeous buildings around a lagoon. This is the only buildings that survive are basically around the University of Chicago to this day. So for example, the Field Museum is a surviving building from this huge event. And part of the reason why they didn't survive was because they were built not to survive. They had steel frames and what was called staff, which was kind of a temporary fake plaster. And as you can see, they built these beautiful buildings and they weren't looking to the future. They said, oh, it's all about the future. In fact, as I've said in this photo, this wonderful photo of this 1890s young woman looking down at the fair, the lagoon of the fair, but right behind her in the photo, which we've deliberately cropped out, was actually an 1893 robot. Some guy dressed up as a robot, you know? Will Smith, problem. Anyway, that's a reference for baby boomers. Anyway, the story is that, but they thought they were looking to the future, but everything they were designing was actually pointed to the past. It was like the end of the century, end of the 19th century. Look how we have come forward. Look at what we've achieved. So there was a lot on technology and there's a lot on the latest ideas. The frontier thesis was first introduced at this fair, for example, you know, and so on and so forth. But what happened was, as I said before, it was not built to last. A lot of the steel was sold in advance. They brought in buildings from all over the world. They brought in people from all over the world, different people. Here's the France building. It's kind of what you have nowadays at Epcot or in Las Vegas, you know. In Las Vegas, you've got this the Eiffel Tower. So everybody knows it's not the real one, but let's have that because we're Americans. We can have it here too, you know. But there was that quality about the place. But in the fringes of this, there were fairgrounds. And that's what the Midway is. If you go down to the University of Chicago, the Midway is still there. And that was where they thought, yeah, fantastic. Hello, you think that we planned this? That was just Megan being Megan. Well done. But you can see behind there is the world's first, what's it called? Ferris wheel, right? I don't need the English language. I'm doing fine. But also they had Little Egypt, which was a young woman of color who danced in a way that they thought the Egyptians would have danced, which was to say provocatively. In other words, you had most of the fair was high culture and sophistication and polish. The whole thing was designed to look like ancient Florence of the Renaissance. But on the fair grounds, you had popular culture. And so you can see it played out. Oh, that's wonderful. I didn't know that, Megan. That's fabulous. So, you know, and all these kinds of pop culture things, you know, showbiz, if you will. And in a quick sense, what happened is that, in our very first essay, the wonderful Rosemarie Bank wrote her piece about the different kinds of peoples they brought in, who were marginalized peoples. And they were presented as being, excuse the word, but primitive. You know, look how advanced we are because look at how primitive they are kind of attitudes. Very, very patronizing, very disrespectful in a lot of ways. But there's all sorts of wonderful stories she tells talking about the attitudes and the different kinds of things, because even though they may not have been treated that well, on the other hand, they were present and they were part of the story. And that's part of what we're talking about here. And that is a Chicago thing, I think, as well. The guy that ran the music for the fair, by the way, was Florence Ziegfeld's father, who was the head of the music school at the university. I think it was called the Chicago Music School or something like that. And he was put in charge of the music, and he sent his son off to Europe to collect the finest classical musicians to perform at this fair. And he came back being Flo Ziegfeld, nobody who was yet, he was in his 20s. He came back and his great catch was a Sandow the strong man, who would dress in barely any clothes and show off his muscles. You know, so Dad was kind of surprised by this. But again, high culture and popular culture were played out at the fair. When the fair was lit up at night, it was because they used electric bulbs. All those buildings were white, so they called it the White City, and it certainly was, and it was spectacular. And 27 million people came to Chicago that summer to visit the fair. And people had souvenirs and relics and all sorts of stuff that they would go back and keep in their family heirlooms for generations after this. The second thing that happened, though, by the end of the summer, the fair closed. And when the fair closed, a a lot, you know, they didn't quite, well, I said they dismantled some of the buildings. What was left, the shells of that, when this winter came, we're about to get there. Yeah, the winter, the winter came, and homeless people moved into these great buildings, great halls that had been emptied out, and accidentally set fire to it. So most of the rest of it actually burned down. When the fair was, so that's part of our story also. Again, the second fire, right? The first one being the Great Chicago Fire. Well, here's the second one. When they built the fair, as you know, the Great Lagoon I showed you before, well, the Great Lagoon was sort of the centerpiece of the whole fair. It's really the trademark. You'll see lots of different images in Chicago history of statuary and so on. But, you know, when the fair sprawled out, and at the northwest and west sides of it was where the L came down, right? Because you got to get all the visitors to the fairgrounds. And when you got off the train at 57th Street, they built what you're looking at now, which are these sort of dilapidated little buildings right at the corner there. The idea was people are getting either off the L, you know, and they want to get some refreshments, or they're going to get back onto it and they want to buy some souvenirs. And these were actually built as temporary little buildings to house the souvenirs and refreshments of visitors. Well, when the fair closed and after the thing burned down, you know, pretty much this was all that's left. You know, I mean, after all the spectacle and spectacular, gorgeous buildings and the latest science, and this was all that was left. But it actually is going to be the birthing place of what's going to happen, because what happened was in 1903, there was a visiting gentleman, he had just been an immigrant really from Norway, a painter named Bror Nordfeldt, Nordfeldt. And Nordfeldt had come from Norway. And he had a job as he was a young man in his 20s, teaching on the faculty of the Chicago School of Art. So he's teaching there, but he doesn't make much money. He's befriending other people. And he and his wife moved into one of these little buildings because rent was so cheap. They didn't have running water. They didn't have bathrooms, but they were clean and they had lots of light. And for an artist, this was fantastic. So he moved in. He got his friend Reinhardt's, oh good Lord, help me again. Do you know what I'm talking about, guys? Nubling. That's not correct. Is that right? The theory of conspicuous consumption. But anyway, but he moved in there too, and he was a professor at the brand new University of Chicago, you know? So they started to bring other friends in, and more and more people started to move into these little buildings and stuff, and artists started to move in because for the same reason, they had lots of light, it was cheap. And yeah, Thorsten Veblen, thank you very much, Shira. God bless. That's exactly right. So Veblen moved in too. But so what happens is that you have artists starting to move in and they start to create a little colony. And being artists and bohemian, they didn't care about what people thought about them or what they looked like or how they dressed or anything. They just wanted to focus on their art. So it's kind of ironic that after this huge fair with all this hoo-ha and these vast giant buildings and tons of publicity, out of the ashes of that, literally, right, comes the start of the brand new arts movement that's going to dominate the 20th century, which is to say, modernism. So these artists didn't care. They just wanted to do their art. They weren't worried about their reputations or making money. They wanted to do their art. And they were dabbling and they were brainstorming the latest forms. So they started, and what started to also happen then was well-to-do Chicagoans who had plenty of money, didn't have to work, and loved the arts. They started to move in also. They formed this colony, and during the day they would do their paintings, or they would write their poetry, or they would write their novels, or they'd work on their dances or their theater. And at nighttime they'd go behind. There was a shared backyard, and they would drink their wine. They'd have dinner together, and they would exchange ideas. And this guy's going to write a poem about that one who paints a painting of him. It's kind of what started to happen, and they're exchanging the latest ideas. It's a genuine bohemian. It's Chicago's really first major bohemian arts community. And in the midst of all this, also what starts to happen is a guy named Floyd Dell, who was from Iowa, moved to Chicago. He was like 23 years old. And he got married to a woman, and they lived actually originally in Rogers Park. And then they moved down to this, it was called the Corner. This neighborhood was called the Corner. It's the arts colony at 57th Street was called the Corner. And and he had gotten a job from the start as the arts editor for a major Chicago newspaper. And he ended up at the age of 23 as becoming one of the major influential voices nationally in the latest movement. Well, he circled around him, he and his wife Marjorie circled around them in their studios, the latest writers that were just getting started in Chicago. Some came from Indiana, some came from Iowa. And just to give you a sense of this, I don't know how many names mean anything to you, but Sherwood Anderson, the poet Vachel Lindsay, the poet Edgar Lee Masters, Carl Sandburg, the poet Arthur Davison Fisk, Theodore Dreiser, Ben Hecht, Maxwell Bodenheim, Kenneth Sawyer Goodman, Al Gerstenberg, Mary Aldous, Ezra Pound was first talked about, as was T.S. Eliot in these circles in America. Harriet Monroe, Margaret Anderson, James Joyce was first talked about here, Clarence Darrow, Emma Goldman, and more, including this remarkable couple who were friends with Dell, George Cram Cook and his wife, Susan Glaspell. So they're brainstorming and they're having their cocktails around, and every Saturday night or something, they would have these great discussions about the latest art and writing and ideas and everything. In time, what would happen, well, and then what happens, they want us to start to do theater. Nobody's a professional playwright, but they all love this stuff and they start to do plays in this place. And one of the key figures was a guy who was from England named Maurice Brown, who came to Chicago because he was chasing after a Chicago socialite named Ellen von Valkenburg, who was an actress. They got married and they started to do theater in this colony. And more people did too, including many in the circle I just mentioned. This became the birth, and this colony continued. Yes, absolutely. This colony would continue through the 20s, die down, but even still there was still arts festivals at Hyde Park in this location for decades and decades and decades later. So there's that. Now, the third chapter in our book is written by Shannon Epplett, and Shannon picks up this story where with Alan Gerstenberg and Maurice Brown. So they're doing the Trojan women in this in the middle of the arts colony, when this guy approaches them and he says, you know, I've got a space here and your guys are kind of cool. Well, Alan Gerstenberg was very well connected with high society, as was Maurice Brown with all his English connections. So it made sense that they would draw attention. And he invited them to come to the, oh God, I'm just blanking again. What's the building? Fine Arts Building, which is still there, guys. You know, it's on Michigan Avenue across from the Bean. And the Fine Arts Building was kind of a honeycomb of all sorts of artists, similar in a way. And he had a nice big space that had been a converted, which would originally been a car dealership that they converted into a nice big theater. But, you know, but what Maurice Brown said was, you know, we don't want that. It's huge. We want stuff that's going to be small, and we want something of that's going to be akin to the kind of small theater dynamics that we're seeing both in Europe, but also to what we experience doing theater amongst our friends in that arts colony on 57th Street. And to make a long story short, he got them to completely renovate what was not intended as a theater space into a tiny little theater. This is 1912, and this became known as the Chicago Little Theater. And many people for many years have credited this as being the first little theater in the United States. I would argue it's actually Laura Dainty Pelham at Hull House, and everybody else has lots of arguments too. But nevertheless, they did remarkable work there and were highly influenced. But the point again is taking this kind of sense. We're not going to use the conventional theaters. We're not going to focus on design particularly, although they did have remarkable designers at the Fine Arts Chicago Little Theater. And the primary designer, by the way, was Bror Nordfeldt, originally the same guy that founded the Arts Colony, and then his student, Raymond Johnson. So it really was the same people. And the thing that also then happened, just as a quick side note before I start to sign off on this, is that I've done subsequent research since the book came out, and I found, and it's going to appear in a collection on Susan Glaspell coming out this year, edited by Ellen Geigner, but how much almost every single person, so many, the major theater, the small theater, non-commercial theater in the United States, the first one that really gets major attention is the Provincetown Players, Cape Cod, and then Greenwich Village. But a remarkable percentage of those people were exactly the same people who came from Chicago in these two circles. It's not a coincidence. So there's a direct link to the founding of non-commercial theater. Remember, we're not going to use conventional theaters with fancy designs in staging and spectacle, to what happened subsequently in New York and then nationally. So thank you very much, and I will defer to my wonderful colleagues.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for laying the groundwork for the beginning of Chicago theater. Section 2 is really when Chicago theater becomes maybe like what you think of it now. Section 2, like I said, sort of follows theater from the 1920s to the 1970s. And that's when it goes from sort of marginalized into institutionalized, is what we argue, right? So we have all these sort of makeshift spaces. Makeshift continues to be a driving force in Chicago theater's creativity and overall ethos. But this is a moment when some of the big theaters get started and some of the big sort of ways of doing theater get started. So the Goodman Theater gets started in the 1920s. Storefront theater, which Chicago is known for, gets started in the 1960s and 70s. Improv really gets going in the mid-century. These things that Chicago's really known for start in the second part of the book. And the first chapter is the chapter that I wrote, which was about the Goodman Theater. So the Goodman Theater opens in 1925, and I could tell you all about how that came to pass, but I will not do that now. You should really get the book. Get the book. I have a discount code for you too, if you want the book. At the end, I'll share the discount code. But you know, so if you've been to the Goodman Theater in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, you may have watched somebody else's show being produced by the Goodman. So just a couple months ago, this last month, they were doing Relentless, which was a timeline theater show, but it was being produced in Goodman's smaller theater. They have a giant proscenium and then a smaller thrust theater. And people think about this now as sort of large scale not-for-profits helping other mid-sized or smaller not-for-profits. This is a thing that happens in the not-for-profit world. But what my research uncovered is that Goodman has been doing this since the very beginning. So since they were founded, they were hosting smaller community groups on their stages back when their theater was at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so I found this program, right? And you can see it's the Goodman Theater, and it used to be inside the Art Institute, but it's the marionette players from Hull House, and it's an Eugene O'Neill play that happened at the Goodman. And so I sort of track all these smaller not-for-profits that were doing performances on Goodman's stage in this chapter. So there was a huge Greek festival that the Goodman hosted that had Greek theater on stage with Greek immigrants. They hosted a Polish opera. They hosted Swedish theater. They hosted Hull House. They hosted all kind of benefits for charity groups. And so I was just trying to show that, you know, this is not, I think people tend to think that really well-resourced groups, sort of like that the charity moves down. And I'm making the argument that actually Chicago theater has a long history of small and large groups sort of working in concert with each other, and that it's not really a charity situation so much as it is pooling resources and making sure that various communities are exposed to one another. So I got a lot of that research. Sarah helped me find a ton of that stuff at the Chicago Public Library, not to be a traitor to the Chicago Public Library, but some other wonderful institutions in town that I got this research from. So this photo is from the Newberry Library, and I also did some research at the Chicago History Museum, all wonderful places to do research on the history of Chicago. The second chapter in this section is by Aaron Krall, and he is faculty at UIC here in Chicago. And he wrote about Theodore Ward's play, Big White Fog. So Aaron does this really wonderful job of telling a lot about the play, giving sort of play analysis. It's one of the few times we do that in the book because our book is so concerned with space and people and ensemble that we don't spend a lot of time doing play analysis. But the reason that Aaron does it is because he's drawing a connection between the sort of makeshift situation that happened with the production of Big White Fog and with the character, what the characters are facing in the play. So they're a Black family that's just been part of the Great Migration, has moved north to Chicago, and they're sort of grappling with that move to the city. The production was a federal theater project production. So the federal theater project was part of the Works Progress Administration during the Depression to put artists back to work. So Chicago had a really large unit for the federal theater project, in addition to having we'll just say, right, having a white unit. This is not the way people thought of it then, but there was also a very large, as they would say in that time, Negro unit, right? There was a lot of Black theater that was being produced through the federal theater project. They were segregated at this time. You can think about sort of what's going on in the 30s, and Jasmine's going to talk a little bit more about how this book deals with race and how space and race are really connected in and almost everywhere in the United States, but in Chicago especially. So Aaron's chapter talks about how the Federal Theater Project mounted this play at the Great Northern Theater, which is a huge commercial space in downtown Chicago on Dearborn Avenue. And it played there for a few weeks. And then for some reason that is absent from the archive, and Aaron sort of speculates about what was going on, the play gets moved to the DuSable High School auditorium on Chicago's South Side. Now, Aaron sort of talks about, is this because it was trying to reach an audience that was more germane to the stories of the people in the text of the play? He's really not sure. But what people anticipated was going to happen is that there would be this huge audience on the South Side for this play, and that is not what happened, in fact. And so Aaron sort of goes through and talks about what happens when the play moves from this downtown sort of fancy commercial theater building into a high school auditorium, and when it goes into this more makeshift space, what it's trying to do, what it can accomplish in those different spaces, and what it can accomplish in those different spaces. The next chapter in the second section is Kat Gleason's chapter, where she really tracks the beginning of what a lot of historians identify as the first storefront. That's really when that word starts getting used. Now, obviously, what Stuart was talking about with those buildings with the little pitched roofs, that's clearly storefront theater, right? Because those were storefronts, they were souvenir stands, and they were used to do theater from the 57th Street Arts Collective, right? But the way that we talk about storefront now is usually sort of placed in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So Kat's husband actually made this map for our book so that she could talk about the Lincoln Avenue corridor. So you can see where the Lincoln Park Zoo is. You can have an idea of where she's talking about. And this was an area that kind of became ripe for gentrification in the early 1970s. And there were a lot of community groups, and there were a lot of church groups actually working in this neighborhood to have some say in what that gentrification looked like. And two of the theaters that Kat tracks that moved into what is now the Greenhouse space, the Greenhouse Theater, are Kingston Mines and the Body Politic. And Kingston Mines and the Body Politic are two of the most important theaters in 20th century Chicago history. Like I said, they really get the storefront idea moving. And also they are who ends up producing Grease. I would say Grease without an exclamation point, because it was a much grittier version of the play. Again, Sarah has all of this at the special collection. She has a lot of the archives from Body Politic and Kingston Mines, and from that original production of Grease before it went off to New York and became, you know, Grease with, and then ultimately to Hollywood with John Travolta, right? It was a sort of a grittier version. But Kat sort of tracks all of the conflicting politics in this neighborhood at the time, and how these theaters were part of that, and how storefront theater and grassroots theater in Chicago has long been political as well. And then the last chapter in the second section is Travis Stern's chapter, which tracks the history of I.O. So he starts by talking about how improv, sort of the history of improv in Chicago, and particularly long form. So long form improv is its origins are really sort of placed in Chicago. You know, the chapter that we don't have in this book that sort of haunts all the chapters is one about Hull House. So in many ways, improv is something that starts at Hull House as well, with Viola Spolin. That's who's in the picture at the beginning of the section that I showed. It was actually Viola Spolin directing at Hull House, and her son, oh my gosh, I'm pulling a Stuart. What's his name? What's Viola Spolin's?
Also,
Paul Sills, right? So he's really seen as like the father of improv in many ways, right? There's a lot of people Travis sort of tracks this moment and how Second City is really unique because it is a commercial theater. So what we've been talking about so far has largely been not-for-profit theater. And Second City comes in as like, can we make this a commercial venture? And then improv in Chicago sort of goes along that line. Now, the improv itself might not be commercial. Sorry, it's Chicago. You can probably hear the sirens outside my window. But also maybe they're setting up in bars and in restaurants. And IO, which, was Improv Olympic before the Olympics sent them a cease and desist to no longer use the word Olympic. So now we say IO to make sure we don't get sued. So IO was in like 27 different locations in its history before it got this building on the near west side. And as those of you who are following along with what happened during the pandemic, IO actually closed. Now there's word that it's been sold. So we're sort of still waiting to see. But that's what Travis talks about at his chapter. And that's the end of the second section. So I'll turn it over to Jasmine.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thanks, Stuart, and thank you all for being here. So as Megan said, we worked on all of these sections, but I particularly kind of worked on the section called Centering the Decentered, Itinerant, Civic, and Home, featuring chapters by Laura Ludwig, Ronika Thomas, and myself. And just 3 quick things to say about the section, then I'll dive into Laura's, is that all of our work was, all of the section was looking at theater in Chicago, kind of starting in the late 20th century with Laura's chapter on Teatro Vista. And in that, a lot of the theater that we're looking at was itinerant. So thinking about kind of what it means to study itinerant theater. The second thing that kind of unified all these 3 chapters is that all of us use some sort of ethnographic methods. Laura's was oral history. Ronika was kind of being present in the spaces of Theaster Gates' work, and mine was a combination of those two. I kind of both had an ethnographic kind of participant observation, but also my chapters in oral history. And then the third thing is our chapters all intimately dealt with race and racism in Chicago, especially with non-white artists. And I'll say a little bit about theater and race as it kind of pervades the entire book, but especially this section. In thinking about Chicago and makeshift theater and kind of the ways in which we define makeshift, we were also thinking really intimately about race and space. And so we foreground a lot of theorists, including Harry Elam, Josh Chambers-Letson, and others that write about theater and race, and thinking about kind of, Harry Elam argues that kind of theater and its theatricality is so intimately tied to the kind of the ways in which race is seen and unseen and what that means. And a second thing to name is that Chicago is the hyper segregated city. It's arguably the most segregated city of the United States. And so thinking about what that racial segregation means for Chicago theater practitioners across the book, but especially in this section. So I'll jump into these 3 chapters. I have my notes right here. This image here from Lord Ludwig's chapter of Reclaiming Space is of the cast of Broken Eggs at the Greenview Art Center in 1991. The play features a Cuban American family, nostalgic for home, and kind of reflecting on kind of the fleeing to the United States and kind of the reflection on kind of loss and home. And in her chapter, she interviews many people beyond Teatro Vista, including Henry Godinez, and I'll just read a little bit of excerpt from that. He said, "This is something that might be fun. It's funny. It can include most of the company, and we can cast it however we want." And so I give this quote, and we show this image to think about the contributions of Laura Ludwig in this chapter. And I want to just name a few of them in this really, really rich oral history of Teatro Vista. First, in thinking about Teatro Vista as a company that was itinerant, Ludwig argues that itinerant Latinx companies are often twice a race. They're a race because of the ways in which racializations often particularly erase Latino people, and also the ways in which itineracy makes it hard to archivally find histories of Latino theater. Second, this chapter that Laura Ludwig writes, it's amazingly rich with oral history. And it's interesting, Megan and Stuart, just thinking about our editing of this, because Laura, rightfully so, was kind of arguing to include these huge chunks of her interviews to honor the oral history of the founders and artists of Teatro Vista. And so really, really honoring that throughout the chapter, but also including her analysis and theorization of that. And third, and kind of the chapter concludes with this amazing rich production history. And so really thinking about the rich production history of Teatro Vista and kind of what that kind of means for Chicago. I'll talk about Laronika's chapters next. And Laronika's chapter, and I'll read a caption about this image first. So this is an image of the interior of Stony Island Arts Bank, with an exhibition of Blyn Ligon, the African-American artist, a small band, and this is an image by Laronika. And so Stony Island Arts Bank is a gallery and archive on the South Side that was renovated and opened by Theaster Gates, who is the subject of Laronika's chapter. And so I want to kind of give the significance of this. Theaster Gates, as many of you know, Black artist who's kind of made a home in the South Side of Chicago. And in this chapter, Laronika is really framing his work that, in one hand has been taken up by the visual arts world as theatrical and as performative. And we as editors thought it was important to include this to think about the questions that Theaster Gates is asking of his spatial practices in the South Side, especially in a South Side that has been kind of devastated by racist policies. And so in this chapter, she interviews Theaster Gates. She includes her ethnographic observations of going to sites of his practices and really questions kind of this, what are the new spatial imaginaries he makes through his performative practice of making kind of art spaces in the South Side of Chicago. And the last chapter I'll talk about really briefly is the chapter that I wrote called Staging Private Lives and the Transformation of Public Lives. And this is a chapter that's an oral history of the Chicago Home Theater Festival. The Chicago Home Theater Festival was founded in 2012 by 3 Chicago-based theater artists, Arina Zadov, Layla Lepard, and Blake Russell. And the festival, it was founded in 2012, and then it began annually in May of 2013, and it ran annually in May of 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, so for 5 years. And I had attended a production in 2015 in Humboldt Park, and the production I went to, it started actually at the Western L station. We got a tour, those attending got a tour of Humboldt Park from a Puerto Rican American resident who was like 3rd generation in the neighborhood. And then we were walked from the station through the neighborhood to the home of 2 Latinx artists who lived in the neighborhood and then who hosted performance in their home. And I remember the night that I saw it, there was poetry performance, dance performance, other types of kind of theatrical performance. And then there also was a kind of, at the end of the performance, a conversation that became a conversation about race and space and theater, and which resulted in like tears and kind of a lot of emotion. And I just remember being really struck by the work that was being done of staging theater in people's homes, especially in people of color's homes, and how that questioned the racialized theatrical geographies of Chicago. So in writing this chapter, I set out to interview the founders, and I interviewed 2 of them, Arina and Lele, and then some of the producers, including Emerging Christian and Maida McNeil. And I was going to kind of write a traditional chapter, or traditional analytic chapter, but in doing these interviews, I just found them so rich with the history of the festival that I decided to make the chapter an oral history that begins kind of with my ethnographic framing of the work, but then continues with the edited excerpts of their interviews. Great. And so with that, I think Megan and I are going to turn to this the epilogue that we wrote. And I'll just say a little bit and I'll hand it back to Megan. So, we went into, I think we had our second round of edits, and we kind of went into kind of the final production process during COVID. Megan was in Chicago. You just had to move back to Chicago, I think, Megan, and was just experiencing, even though things were being shut down, the still flurry of activity that was happening with virtual performances, but also with street performances. And so in talking to Megan and Stuart, Megan and I kind of decided to write this epilogue that centered the activity of Chicago theater during this time, and also really tied back to the theme of our book as makeshift, thinking about kind of the nimbleness of Chicago theater artists to still make art during the pandemic, especially a pandemic that was heightened by renewed attention to racial equity. I interviewed Jocelyn Prince, a theater artist who was making theater on a corner in Chicago that was kind of focused on racial equity. And then Megan did a lot of groundwork interviewing a variety of theater artists. And Megan, I'll turn it back to you to talk a little bit more about our epilogue.
Yeah, so the epilogue, and I will give credit to Northwestern Press. They were like, you should capture this moment. We were like, yeah, we really should. And so we wrote just this quick little ending chapter about what does theater, you know, if we go all the way back to Stuart's section, right? Theater born of the ashes, right? So what happens when we're living in the middle of twin pandemics and what's happening with theater? And so, like Jasmine said, she tackled sort of 2 theater artists, and then I talked to the production manager of Court Theater, Jen Gatta, who writes beautifully. She wrote me this just beautiful email. They left their setup on stage and then they left the camera on, and they left it as a live feed for like 6 months of just the stage empty as it collected dust, and they played the soundtrack for the show that was supposed to be happening. And then I also spoke to the neo-futurists. The neo-futurists really pivoted very quickly. It's like the word of the pandemic, right? And they started sending out to everyone who sent them like $5 a week digitally. They would deliver to them an exclusive link to YouTube videos of their short plays. So the Infinite Wrench was happening. It became digital theater that you could watch over the weekend, and then the next week you get a new one. And so you'd see, you know, those of you who are familiar with the neo-futurists, some of those plays came from week to week, right? Because they roll a die to decide how many plays are going to stay in the show. And so we just talked about sort of how different theater groups in Chicago dealt with the pandemic. But we have talked to you now for like 50 minutes. So let us stop talking and open the floor for you to start talking to us, because we'd love to answer any questions or tell you more in the time that we have left.
Thank you so much to Megan, Stuart, and Jasmine. This has been wonderful. I've enjoyed working with you as researchers. I'm so excited, and congratulations on your book. It's always fun to see something tangible come from the archives. So please go ahead and post questions. We do have one question already. Thanks for it all being fascinating, they say. Was there a puppet theater presence in Chicago in the early and or mid 20th century? Shannon, thanks for chiming in that Ellen Van Valkenburg of the Chicago Little Theater sort of pioneered the puppet theater in the 1910s. Do one of our panelists want to address that?
I mean, you know, Shannon is the expert, so he's posing this in a way that's, let me ask you this question, but tell you, and he's right. Of course he's right, because Ellen von Valkenburg, who again was an affluent Chicago high society woman who became an actress, also was fascinated with puppetry. I think that puppetry is something that's just sort of come and gone and comes back again regularly. And I think what's fascinating, I mean, there's a zillion things that are fascinating about it, but it's also been a hallmark often of little theater, not only in the United States, but internationally as well. And I think it's also fascinating because we tend to think of little theater in terms of, puppetry in terms of children. But the fact of the matter is that puppetry has a long tradition also with avant-garde theater, largely because it's symbolic, and also because then it links into things like Chinese theater, Balinese theater, and so on and so forth. It's really quite remarkable in its ability to add scope and meaning, and is still to this day. But I think that, and then the other person I would really point to with strong Chicago ties, that Mark Larson, our esteemed friend, points out, because Mark worked with him, you know, was Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. And Kukla, Fran, and Ollie were big, became big, and Mark will no doubt correct me, rightfully, but they really became big on television in the late 1940s. And all the way through. And when I worked at the Goodman in about 1980 or so, Greg Mosier brought them to the Goodman to perform in the small space at that time. And I remember distinctly because the Goodman had to post an advertisement saying, "Don't bring children," because people thought, oh, they're the adorable little puppets. You know, here's Kukla with his bald head, and then here's Ollie with his big tooth. You know, all that stuff. And so parents brought their children, but what Bertilstrom was doing was anti-war stuff. It was very serious, and I could still hear the poor little children crying because the parents were taking him out because they thought it'd be cute and funny, but he had something very important to say and very serious to say. And
Yeah.
and Mark was his assistant for many, many years. Is the point.
Yeah, and just quickly too, this really isn't part of this book, although someday I will have a book that talks about this. Puppet theater was also a huge part of immigrant theater in Chicago, and Chicago has a really long and rich history of immigrant theater. And I was putting in the chat too that Chicago is still a major capital of puppetry and toy theater too in Chicago. There are a lot of artists who are working with that kind of theater, and the Chicago International Puppet Theater Festival takes place every year here in Chicago.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot right here too. So, and I think of other theaters that are in Chicago that have come and gone, like Red Moon, that have really represented the puppetry in that as well, which we've got some in our archives. So I don't see any more questions for today. Thank you so much, everyone who attended, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. Congratulations again on your book. Got my copy right here. And Megan, did you have a code you wanted to share out?
Oh, you're muted, Megan.
Sorry, yep, let me just find that. The press was very excited about it's NU 2020. So let me put it in the chat for you if anyone wants to use that code, and it's you can buy it at the press website. I'll put that in the chat too. It's a good read. I know we sound very scholarly, and we are, but also like it reads easily and there's lots of pictures.
Some of those pictures are from our archive, which I was so excited to share those with you. And of course, we have copies here at the library too. If you want to check out a copy here and of Mark's book that we mentioned several times, Ensemble.
I want to add a little pitch too.
Yeah.
If you wander, anybody who's been to Chicago, anybody who's wandered the streets of Chicago or attended those theaters, I think that's what's extraordinary is not just being a historian or a scholar, but I mean, it's just kind of like saying, where did that come from? I mean, walk up Lincoln Avenue. I mean, or those different spaces, or all the places that used to be that aren't anymore. But really, there's wonderful books on Chicago art, but there's also wonderful books on Chicago architecture, and little things like the Goodman used to be at the Art Institute, but now, of course, it's in a different location. But I think that one thing I really get a kick out of reading my colleagues' stuff is so much, it's like the hidden stories behind all these places. And they're great people, they're fascinating people and fascinating stories that people just generally don't really necessarily know anything about. So educate yourself, bring your friends, have a nice dinner, and get some drinks.
Yeah. And thanks to Michelle for saying in the, she was saying, I never realized how closely linked Chicago theater is to the growth of the city itself. And I think that's really true and a great point. Thanks so much for offering that, Michelle.
Yeah, we can definitely see in Chicago how our theater works within our communities, and our communities, they say Chicago's a city of neighborhoods. It's a city of theaters in those neighborhoods as well. So thank you so much to everyone for attending today. It was my pleasure to host at Chicago Public Library this wonderful presentation today.